We're here at the Walker Arts Center for a Regis dialogue with filmmaker Mike Leigh. We'll be discussing the work of this remarkable director who moves readily from theater to television to film. In his 10 feature films that are the focus of this retrospective, Mike Leigh is nothing if not a student of contrasts. In his films, life is at once bleak and sweet. The haves and the have-nots eye each other with equal amounts of suspicion and envy. And everyone, regardless of where he or she comes from, longs for a sense of purpose and meaningful human connection. I'm Scott Foundas, film critic for the LA Weekly. We'll now begin our Regis dialogue with Mike Leigh. Mike, I want to begin by asking you about something that we talked about on stage at the New York Film Festival a couple of weeks ago, which is your process, for lack of a better term. And I know that it's something that you've said before, including on stage at the New York Film Festival, that you don't like to talk about because filmmakers are usually just asked about the end product of their films and not the process. But I think your end products are quite unique in the canon of contemporary world cinema. The characters seem more vivid and lifelike. The films, they're quite sui generis, for lack of a better term. And so I think a lot of this is rooted in the process of how the films come to be made. But before I get to that, maybe you can actually talk a little bit about how you came to create works in the theater and then film in the first place, since I know you originally trained as an actor at the prestigious Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts.
Actually, I was going to, whilst you were speaking, I was wondering what I was going to say. I was going to say, before I get on to the biographical bit, the autobiographical bit, which I will, if you like, I was thinking, you know, you're right to say that the nature of what I put on the screen, of course, relates to the way I go about creating it. And I think, on the whole, that's true of all art. You know, obviously you understand the medium and the message in terms of the medium itself. But in some ways, it's a kind of, I mean, to talk about it, is a kind of chicken and egg affair, because obviously the way that I've evolved to work is in order to put on the screen what I aspire to being a kind of screen reality, which began for me by my own reaction to movies at a very early age. I mean, I grew up in Manchester in the north of England. I was born in the war during World War II. And I was watching, going to the pictures, as we called it, watching movies from a pretty early age, and certainly into the 1950s as a growing into a young teenager, I would be at the pictures just as often as you could afford it or get away with it, really. And I always used to sit in the cinema thinking, wouldn't it be great if you could see a film, have films where the people were like real people, like instead of being like people in films. And that really, I mean, that kind of, I mean, before we even talk about movies or indeed theatre, I mean, just the kind of impulse, the need to capture life and to tell stories about it, you know, to use it, to excite people with, you know, just looking, you know, people that, somebody said only yesterday that the thing about Happy-Go-Lucky is that Poppy is just interesting. But to me, people are interesting. I mean, that is the starting point. So where do the stories come from? What's it about? It is that people are, you know, we are fascinating. I mean, it's not news. That's, you know, it's what motivates, what has always motivated artists of all kinds. So I answer the question of, or deal with the issue of the method and the means and the substance by starting with what actually motivated me in the first place. A compulsion to capture life and put it on the screen. Of course, it also, I mean, the other thing that's important, and that sometimes people sort of seem to assume is kind of vulgar and therefore doesn't apply to what I do, as though I'm in some sort of religious order, is that, in fact, I'm in show business. You know, I mean, I'm an entertainer. You know, I mean, I've always been compelled to tell jokes and make people laugh and make people and confront people and make people care and, you know, and all those things. That is, you know, if you're that way inclined, it's a disease and it's in your bloodstream and it's unavoidable, you know. So that's to say, all those things are about where you start from. So I was always fascinated by the whole notion of, as I say, capturing life. When I was 12, I remember being at my grandfather's funeral. It's a very, very cold and snowy day in Manchester, and everybody was crammed into the hall. And the guys were staggering down the stairs with the coffin. And I remember thinking, this would make a great film. And then thinking, clairvoyant flash, thinking, that's what I want to do. I want to make films about this sort of thing, you know, about things, you know. So, again, that's all about that. But at the same time, I mean, you know, and this is what more than anywhere, most obviously comes out in Topsy-Turvy, but it comes out in all my things if you really think about it, is that, you know, I loved to go to pantomimes, as we call them, and the back end of music hall, Varieties it's called, vaudeville, was still going on when I was a kid, and I would get to that. Circus was exciting, you know. Plays, obviously, musical theatre. But all those things were a turn-on as well. So in other words, the exotic, if you like, the exotic sort of, if you like, you can go as far as to say the sort of decorative, escapist part of it is part of the turn-on as well. And I was, you know, I was first in line when there was a school play, and you know, I put things on, and etc. You know, so any opportunity. I also was a would-be journalist, and I edited various magazines and newspapers and things. I'm glad to say that I haven't ever degenerated into that diseased profession. So I was always, you know, all those things. But what fascinated me as much as anything was performance and, you know, the whole thing of making stories up. And, of course, you know, really, the idea of making movies had really captured my imagination by the time I was 15, 16 or so. Coming, incidentally, from a background in which the very notion of going into show business was completely anathema. I mean, it was just unheard of, and, you know.
Your father was a doctor.
He was a doctor. He was a doctor, and not only was he a doctor, but his father was made a living. Everyone remember those. We used to be sort of photographs airbrushed in and coloured in and put in frames, and, you know, collars and ties put in and swirly backgrounds and all of that. And that's what Grandpa did for a living. And in the Depression, he couldn't feed the family because nobody wanted pictures and picture frames, which is what he also did. People wanted loaves of bread. He also employed a strange collection of chain-smoking renegades, which they call the artists, who used to, when I was a kid, I used to go and they used to sit in the back room with airbrushes, chain-smoking and doing all these endless things to these photographs. In the war, in World War II, he did very well because, you know, if Johnny, you know, had gone off to fight, and all we had was a picture of Johnny at the local famous seaside resort, Blackpool, with an unknown female. The Grandpa and his team could remove the female. This is long before Photoshop, you know. Remove the female and put in a collar and tie again and take out Blackpool Tower or put in Blackpool Tower or whatever you wanted. And there it stood in a nice frame on the mantelpiece or the sideboard. And so in the 50s, when I was a tiny kid, I used to go and see this room full of ancient chain-smoking artists. But in the slump, in the depression, the word artists to my father meant penury and starvation. So anything that he could do to dissuade me from doing that, he did. Anyhow, to answer your original question, because I can see another question forming on your lips. And that's only because you feel you're not earning your keep, but don't worry, stay tuned. I was fascinated by the possibility of doing it all. And I was actually fascinated by acting, though I instinctively knew that I didn't want to be an actor. But I did apply to RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, it's singular, and got a scholarship at a ridiculously young age of 17. I really didn't really know what I was doing, but that's what I did. And I trained as an actor at a time in that particular mode of training where it was extremely old-fashioned and sterile and pretty well dead, really. It was old-fashioned boulevard theatre. But that was very good because, one spent the entire time asking questions and wondering about things, and it, made me alert. And briefly, from there I acted for a bit, for a very short time in a couple of films and things. Went to two art schools, which was important, and to the London Film School, all within the first half of the 60s. So, to get back to your question, I was fascinated by acting. I wanted to write. I knew I wanted to and could direct. I'd started to do that. And it occurred to me very early on that somehow you could take the writing process and rehearsal processes and throw them together and combine them and break down the barriers. The other thing that happened to me, which I think is important to throw into this reply, is that because the actor training had been as uncreative as it had been, it was very old-fashioned, as I say. It was all about very external things. It was about learning the lines and not falling over the furniture.
The method had not come to to RADA.
No, we knew about it, of course. This is 1960 to 62, so it was around. Stanislavski was around, I mean, John Cassavetes' first film was kicking around, Shadows. Things were happening. There were things going on. But in that academy, it was very, very prescriptive and old-fashioned and uncreative. Within a couple of years of doing that, I found myself at Camberwell Art School in South London, which is famous for its drawing, on the one-year foundation course. And one bright, sunny day in South London, in a disused or ex-elementary school, a small building, which they'd taken over for life drawing, we all stood round in this group, and we all were working away quietly and very intensively, drawing the model. And I suddenly looked round and I thought, what's happening in this room is the very thing we never experienced at drama school. Every one of us is looking at real life, investigating something real and finding a way of expressing it, and doing so with completely organic truth and integrity, as distinct from a very superficial approach to plays that we'd done, where you didn't ever discuss who the character was, or you never explored or improvised, or, it was very kind of mechanical, basically. And that moment set me thinking about the possibilities of the actor as artist, the actor as artist in his own right, or her own right. So that, allied to various kinds of ideas that were floating around, and particularly, in the early, particularly the mid-60s, all kinds of barriers had started to come down, in culture, and, of course, the extreme manifestation of what I'll be talking about over which some people will remember, the so-called happenings. And there were all kinds of things happening in art and music and popular music and indeed in cinema, which were to do with new ways of investigating things. And I guess I was part of that. The zeitgeist was that, was going on. But there was a lot of work went on, particularly in, obviously, Warhol was making those bizarre experimental films.
Were you able to see those?
Oh, yes, definitely, very much so. My instinct to them was, great wheeze, great fun, great thing, but not really not storytelling, really not dealing with how people really are, not really making a three-dimensional, not because apart from anything else, having watched movies until I was 17 and went to London, all I had ever seen in my Manchester formative film-going experience was British and American movies. I never saw a film that wasn't in English until I went to London. Of course, I went to London and, bam, I discovered world cinema. So, of course, that was the real, most important influence and inspiration, and part of my education was just discovering world cinema. And, of course, my instincts were and remain ultimately what certainly for purposes of expressing what I am here, classical in the sense that, formally constructed films, properly constructed scenes, shot in a disciplined way, we're using the tools of cinema to do all kinds of things and taking to the cutting room all kinds of resonant layers and subtle options and, different scales and all the rest of it, which, of course, a lot of the experimental work, not only in, like Warhol or some cinematic things, but also in art and indeed in literature and music. A lot of, I suppose you could say that there was a lot of kind of formalist or quasi-formalist art, whether there was a self-conscious displaying of the form rather than using the form to actually go beyond that and get to a distillation or expression of life. In fact, some people regarded it as rather square, rather conservative of me to want to tell narrative stories that you could relate to and so forth. No, it's true. I say that without irony. It is the case. It was considered to be rather old-fashioned, and having with all those things going on, and having discovered at a very early stage that the actual process of sitting in a room writing, although I enjoy writing if I'm writing something which isn't of a dramatic nature, that somehow writing scripts and then going to trying to find ways of making them come to life was simply in some way arid, and that somehow, as I say, it occurred to me that you could combine all the things together. And anyhow, if one was going to be talking about filmmaking, which was my aspiration, whenever I could get that to happen, it seemed a very natural thing. But and then with that was the notion that of exploring acting in a more in a richer way than would generally conventionally be the case. So from the middle of the 60s, for the rest of the 60s, I, in various venues, and this was the point in history where the so-called fringe theatre was born in the UK, which is kind of off-Broadway kind of theatre. I did about 10 plays, which I called improvised plays, but that always confused everybody because, in fact, they were built from improvisation, and they were very finished pieces of work. Until such a time as I could get a movie made, which, as you know, was my first feature in 1971, Bleak Moments, which is that in the retrospective?
Yes.
Yeah. And that, in fact, I took the source from a play called Bleak Moments, which I'd done, and reinvestigated the central characters and opened it out and really made a film. And that was the beginning of making films in this way.
Well, I can't think of much of a better segue to looking at a scene from Bleak Moments. For people who may not have seen the film in the retrospective, I should just say that this is a movie about a lonely typist, Sylvia, who at this point in the film has just been on a date with this rather introverted teacher and taken him back to her apartment for a late night drink.
Would you like some nuts?
No. No, thank you.
I haven't got any nuts. Anyway.
So I just watching that, I haven't seen it for a while, but just thinking about it, it bookends with happy-go-lucky at the other end of a thousand-year span. And, of course, I think what's interesting, apart from anything else, is that one of my endless preoccupations in life and in my films is the collision of people with a sense of humour, people with no sense of humour. And so, I mean, and actually, Sylvia is, when I stop and think about it, and I haven't thought about it much, is a kind of ancestor of Poppy, because actually, there she is, so the sense of humour, subverting the situation and, doing all of that. And there is this guy, totally out of his depth, just because he hasn't got a sense of humour.
Well, and the scene kind of runs the gamut from being quite funny early on to being then actually quite painful and almost agonizing.
Yes, and of course the other gamut it runs is that this is a relationship which is sexually doomed, and Poppy gets it together with great sexual gusto because she meets the right guy, basically. So, I mean, I think what I've done, finally, after 18 films later, I've got a relationship on the go between characters who really do click. But that's where it started, at the other end of the spectrum.
Well, maybe without giving away too many trade secrets, you could say something about how a scene... This is actually a much longer scene, even than what we showed. There's a lot before.
Oh, this is interminable, this scene. the whole film is interminable, isn't it?
But what are the building blocks of a scene like that? How long does it take? How does it come together?
Well, I mean, the point is that, first of all, making these films, starting with the journey of the whole thing of making these films. For each film, it's a journey of discovery as to what the film is. So, I mean, I don't have a script because people get very confused about there not being a script. What we shoot is very, as you can see, is very, very precise. I mean, what you've just seen is totally worked out down to the very last nuance. And I think, in a way, that scene's a very good illustration of one of the fundamental principles of how I work. People talk about, the dialogue and writing the dialogue. And, well, of course, that's what we do, and we do it very precisely. But, of course, the dialogue and the space between words and the subtext, the things that are going on under the surface, all of those things are dealt with in a compound and complete way. So what you've just seen, for example, I mean, it's meticulously rehearsed, irrespective of whether they're speaking or one of the other things are happening on all the various levels in which they are. And to arrive at that, which is the final thing, obviously, and the thing that matters, it's really a whole process, and it's been consistently the case throughout all of these films, of my overseeing the bringing into existence of the whole world of the film in such a way as I've kind of got it to happen so that you've got implicitly in the dynamics of that world the raw elements, the premise, the basic potential drama of the film. Working always for a substantial period of time before we actually get out there and make the film up or before we shoot anything. Because what I'm concerned with is to make characters who appear to be, or work in a way where they appear to be, for all intents and purposes, like real people. And therefore, they have to be three-dimensional. So, what doesn't happen, and I say this because some popular misconceptions lead people to suppose that this is what happens. What doesn't happen is my getting together a group of actors saying, great, well, here we are, everybody. Here's a situation. Let's improvise it and see what happens. That is not what happens, because that is a very useful and fun thing to do as a kind of warm-up exercise or something, but it does not produce material that is in any shape or form either A, like real life, or B, useful and viable as serious dramatic material. What I do, beginning to answer the question, is to work individually with each actor to create a character. And that's a very long and slow and careful and private process. I only work, when I do that, there's nobody else ever there. It's me and whichever actor it is, which is partly a matter of talking about all kinds of real people and partly a job of getting a character going, quite often putting real people together and blending them. And it's a very complicated process. But out of it comes a character to which we give birth, and we invent the whole life, and we christen the character, and so on and so forth. Who once the actor has knows who he or she is, knows the character to a greater or lesser extent, can then start to work with other characters. Of course, not all the situations in all my films, by any matter of means, are in the actual stories, are situations in which people meet each other for the first time, or like these people have just got to know each other lately. I mean, there are massive combinations of characters who are parents and children, who are married people, who are brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth. And by all kinds of elaborate means, we investigate those. Having got this core characters together, we then put them together and live through the years and years of their lives, really, and build those up over a long period of time. So finally arriving at this whole world. And during the course of doing that, you've got a great deal of discussion, a great deal of research goes on. People go and research absolutely anything you can think of which helps to make authentic, teachers' research, teaching, plumbers' research. I mean, if you've seen Life is Sweet, Claire Skinner, who plays one of the two twin sisters, who was the plumber, to this day, actors and other people phone her up and say, my toilet's broken, can you come in and fix it? So, as it. And then a huge amount, massive amounts of improvisation goes on. One of the most, I think what's important to say, just since you've got me talking about this, I think it's important to understand how an important key aspect of how it works and what makes it work, is that when I ask an actor to take part in one of these things, I say, look, please come and be in this film. I can't tell you anything about the film at all, and such as is in my head, I'm not going to tell you anyway, because we're going to find that out. The film doesn't exist. We're going to discover the film. And that is the truth. I mean, that will be the case for me, even though I may start with various kinds of notions. I can't tell you what the character's going to be, because you and I are going to collaborate to create that character. And as much as anything, what's important is that each actor agrees and understands that he or she will never know anything about the whole film or what's going on except what his or her character knows. So that famous example, when we were preparing Vera Drake, there was a famous 10-hour improvisation, which is to say a lot of actors in their costumes, in character, staying in character for 10 hours. We worked in a disused hospital, and at one end there was a building where there were flats where the doctors and nurses had used to stay overnight if they were on night duty. So that was their flat. This is all like a couple of months or so before the shooting. At the other end there was a ward, big Anderson ward, a big hospital ward. On this particular occasion, if you've seen the movie, this was the raw material, the improvisation that engendered a major section of the major part of the film, major part of the story. The family came round to celebrate the engagement, and the brother and his sister, his wife, the sister-in-law were going to tell them that she was pregnant. And all of a sudden, knock on the door, the police arrived. The other actors had no idea that was going to happen. They didn't know there were actors playing police. The actors playing her family did not know that Vera Drake was an abortionist. They just didn't know. They'd never found out. They didn't know that she'd been coming to other rehearsals and we'd worked with all these other women who'd had abortions. We'd done all that. She didn't know that the cops were going to show up. She didn't know that we'd done all this work with the police and doctors and to do with the abortion that had gone on, all improvised and we'd gone through all that. These actors didn't know that the other actors, the police team, had arrived much earlier in the day and that we'd built the police station in the ward, and it was all ready for when she was arrested. They didn't know that we'd spent 2 whole days with a retired police inspector, etc., etc. And the police didn't know. They thought they were going to be confronted by an aggressive woman who was going to deny everything, basically. And this thing was mammoth and huge and a great a traumatic experience for everybody involved, including me. I mean, for me, you can imagine my job, having spent a very long time over months building up to that occasion and having no idea what was going to happen. For me, it's amazing. It's like watching a movie. But, of course, the joy of it is that I sit there, and this applies through every scene in every aspect of every film I've made. I mean, my job is to sit there thinking, great, this is obviously overall rich material, and then thinking, yes, no, that's wrong, yes, and it's all there to deal with, to work with, to interact with, to deconstruct, reconstruct, which 2.5 months later we did in the location, and we drew. So the actors were all able to draw from that, from the emotional recall of that, and that's the source material. And out of that we built the scene. Now, everything you see in my films, to a greater, varying only in terms of scale, comes into existence on that kind of principle, from that thing. But that is only, what I've just described could only happen after months and months of the whole, we'd been through the whole of their lives and how they met, Vera and her husband, way back when, and all the things that happened during World War II. And during exploring the World War II, there were 2 guys that we had down the road in the Imperial War Museum in South London, in Lambeth, who were happily there for anybody in the cast who showed up just to work on, fill in background about what happened to their character during World War II. When we did Topsy Turvy, there was a massive amount of research went on. Of course, Topsy Turvy is slightly different in the canon because, of course, although there was a great deal, everything that's on screen has been arrived at by using these approaches and techniques. Of course, I was dramatising in broad terms, historical events that actually took place. But, in Topsy Turvy, for example, it is the case that W.S. Gilbert did, at the dress rehearsal of the Mikado, cut the famous Punishment Fits the Crime Mikado song. It's thought, because there are 2 songs in the show about lists of criminals to be punished, and many people think, and I do, that he picked the wrong one to cut. But the important thing is that the chorus did apparently go to him in a posse and persuade him to reinstate the song, which appealed to my ordinary sense of grassroots politics, really. And that's what I dramatise. But nobody, you can read about that in any number, every book on the subject will tell you, but nobody tells you exactly what happened or who said what or, where the discussions took place or anything of the sort. So we had to bring it into existence anyway, really.
Well, you were saying because you don't know where something's going when you're starting, how much do you need to have in your head, to start a project? How much do you have to know that there's something there?
It depends on the film. It absolutely does. So that, for example, I'm old enough born when I was, I just already declared that, I'm old enough to remember what it was like before the 1967 Abortion Act for people with unwanted pregnancies. And it was not good, and I'd had it in mind for over 40 years to do a film one day about an illegal abortionist set sometime before that date. And that sat. So when we came to do that film, I mean, before I even cast it, there was a very clear sense of, because I did a huge amount of research into the nature of what went on and all kinds of women and background. Vera Drake herself is a total invention, by the way, but drawn from just general research. It was the actual structure and the need for the certain characters was very, very clear. You would need to have women who needed abortions, you would need to have a family, you would need to have police, you would need to have a judge and doctors, etc., etc. And so, but that doesn't give you the film. That's merely the objectives, the structure, the general. But I cast her family, but I didn't know who exactly they were. That really was explored, and all kinds of things were explored. And as I've just described, I mean, actually, in the investigation of the scene that I've just described, I mean, there were certain key things that, for example, in the scene, if you remember, when they go to the police station, the detective inspector decides to get Vera to tell her husband why she's there and what's happened, what she's been doing for all these years. Now, that happened, I didn't think of that, that happened in the improvisation. Peter White, who played the detective inspector, a brilliant actor, his character thought of that. And of course, it was a great bonus, because it meant, if you remember in the scene, and this is merely me then using that for other, with other advantages, dramatically, that alleviated the need for us hearing, us, the audience, being told something that by that time we'd found out, really, we already knew twice over, because you just saw her quietly whispering to him, and that was much more poignant. But that came out of the character's decision that that's what should happen, for example. So it's always investigation when it comes to the crunch. But that's an example of a film where it was very clear what I wanted to do. There are people in my family, very close to me, who have two lots of people who have adoption-related experiences. And for a whole number of years, I had it in mind to deal with that in a film. Actually, I'm talking about people who adopted kids because they couldn't have them. But once I started to research that, which led me towards Secrets and Lies, of course, it became clear to me that actually what's interesting isn't so much the experience of the adoptee and the relationship between the adoptee and his or her adoptive parents, so that is interesting. Far more important, or interesting in a way, is the relationship between the birth parent, the birth mother, and the baby. So again, that was a film where I went in with a clear sense of the agenda. But again, I didn't know, I got the elements in place, but I had to explore and investigate to arrive at the film. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, films like Naked or Happy-Go-Lucky, really, all I can report for those two films, and I think also probably All or Nothing, pretty much, is that all I can report is that I had a feeling, a sense of the spirit of the thing, and no more than that. Although, obviously, inevitably, when you're going to do things, you start to think, well, you could have this, you could have that. You know, I mean, for example, when I was casting, what quite often happens, it happened on Happy Go Lucky, it happened on All or Nothing, is that exactly the same thing happened. You know, if you've seen All or Nothing, the central protagonists have a son and a daughter who look very similar and are singularly overweight. And in the auditions, I mean, you would have had to have been blind or stupid not to spot that this actor and this actress could play brother and sister. And since Timothy Spall, who is something of a rotund person himself, was already in place to be in the film, I thought, oh, well, that's a good idea. That can be their kids. Whoever they are, we'll find that out when we get to it. Similarly, talking about Happy Go Lucky, the first creative decision of all was to make a film with Sally Hawkins at the centre of things. That was a given, because I felt now was the time to do it. She was in both the previous films, and she's very brilliant, and I thought it was the right thing to do. During the course of the audition, and when I talk about auditions, I mean, I always, whenever I'm doing a film, though I we're only going to get a small number of people together, I do take the opportunity of meeting a whole lot of new actors anyway. And 2 actresses materialised quite randomly during the course of those auditions, Caroline Martin and Kate O'Flynn, who plainly could look like Sally Hawkins and be her sisters. So I thought, let's have 2 sisters for this character. And that was them. You see the film, and it looks like it's essential, because that's the whole point. You know, you then, your imagination is stimulated, and you find the reason for, you know, for them to be there. Because of your very legitimate question, and I've talked about this, it always starts to seem to me at this point in talking about these things that one is starting to talk about these films as though, well, at best, as though it was a play, because the real meat and bones of the thing and the bottom line is that we're talking about movies. So this whole preparatory thing, this whole way of preparing, and then the far more important thing than that, which is that we go out on location and we make up a film as we go along, is very much about the work of everybody involved, both sides of the camera, not least my work with the cinematographer, with the designer, with the costume designer, the makeup designer, the sound man, and in fact everybody basically. There always comes a stage with each film, when I've spent some time getting to a point with the raw material when I've just got a focus on a sense of what the film potentially is. And of course there's not a script, where I sit down with the cinematographer and the others and say, look, and in the case of Happy Go Lucky, for example, I would just say, look, it's about this woman, it's about Poppy. I describe Poppy, her energy, her, you know, joie de vivre, positive, you know, ebullience, humour. And I said, you know, it has to be burst with colour and light. The corollary is when we had exactly the same conversation at the time of Naked. I remember saying, you know, it's nocturnal, it's a guy on a journey. There's a sense of the apocalypse. There's a, you know, and in the case of that film, we all shoot tests. You know, we talk about the look, the colour, the palette, you know, all those things, which is absolutely essential, and that informs everything we do. And interestingly, I think maybe for me, once we've got to that stage, because I've still got a long way to go with the rest of the development of that then feeds back into decisions I make about characters and things. It's a circular process, you know. On that film, on Naked, we decided to use a so-called bleach bypass process. It's not just a process, it's actually missing out one of the things that happens in the laboratory so that you get this particular kind of monochromatic quality. With Happy-Go-Lucky at the other extreme. I talked about the colour, and we were about to shoot tests, and Dick Pope went to this to the British Film Industry Trade Fair where Fuji set up stall, and this was like literally 3 days before we were about to shoot some tests over a weekend, and they announced this wonderful new motion picture stock called Vivid, which is wonderful primary colours. So we used that, and we also decided to use to shoot widescreen and so forth. I think it's important. There's a great deal. We can talk at great length about the filming, but it's very important that ultimately, and I think this is the last thing I want to say about this, if I can get away with it, is that for all the potential richness, such as it is, of the raw material, I can't, and this slightly answers your question about the final scene, you see, I can't write or make a sequence or a scene unless I'm in the location and I can see it. The writing and the seeing of it, the physicality, the three-dimensionality of it is all part of it. I can't do it theoretically on paper somewhere. I explore the action in the location. And if you look carefully, if you were to conduct the exercise of getting hold of the DVDs and going through my films and looking at the number of scenes and pieces of action where if you think about it carefully, you will realise that we must have created the action in that location. We must have written it by being there. Because, you'll see it happens a lot. And it's really all about, because for me, film is not only about people. It's not only about, when I talk about capturing the world, it's not only capturing people, but it's about place. It's about things. It's about the interaction of, it's about the quality of light and of seasons and weather and shadows and time of day and all those things, which is not a big deal if you talk to any poet. I mean, that's what it's about, but that's the case, and so those things we can only arrive at by working with the actual plastic material itself, and that is filmmaking, really.
Well, I'm glad that you raised it, actually, this idea of the visual component of the films. I think it's something that is not... A lot of writing about your films does not concentrate on it, even though I think we can see, even in that scene from Bleak Moments, which is your very first film, that the visual language is highly developed. And it's quite an interesting choice that you made in that scene that the two characters are filmed separately for almost the entire scene, everything before what we saw and then up until almost the very end of the scene, we finally see them in the same shot. Given that was just your first film, I'm wondering, if you can talk a little bit about how you developed your, visual storytelling language. Is it something that you feel came from watching other films, or?
Yes, yes. I mean, I am. What did you say? Something funny, or did I? Did somebody fart or something? No, absolutely. I mean, I personally, the only reason I resent being here tonight is not because I'm missing the debate. It's because tonight is the first night of the London Film Festival, and every year I clear my diary. Because I'm a well-known filmmaker, I get a free ticket, and I spend 3 weeks watching movies, right? Because I'm a compulsive movie watcher, and I have been all my life, and it is a central, it's the lifeblood, really. So by the time I made Bleak Moments, that was very much, part of what it was about, really. But having said that, I mean, I have to say, I'm not a filmmaker who references. I mean, I don't make films about films. I don't reference things consciously while I'm doing them. But it informs Actually, that film. I mean, when we made that film, and you may just get this a little bit from what you've just seen. I don't know. We actually talked quite a lot about Vermeer. Actually, I mean, we talk about there are other references and other things that are influences too, really. But it is. Excuse me. It is. There've been some really brilliant reviews in last weekend in the New York Times and the LA Times particularly of Happy-Go-Lucky. Extensive, intelligent reviews that talk about the characters and the action. No mention of the cinematography. No mention of Dick Pope, who's shot all my films. No mention of the design, And it's not that these journalists are unaware of those things, but they just don't think about it really because, and yet it is absolutely fundamentally central to what makes the film as good as it is, if it is,
And Bleak Moments got quite brilliant reviews in the UK, and even here Roger Ebert called it a masterpiece.
Yes.
But then it's 17 years before you make another film for cinemas. And in the meantime, you make a lot of films for British television, as a lot of quite interesting filmmakers were doing at that time, including Stephen Frears and Alan Clark.
And Ken Loach, particularly.
And Ken Loach. Can you give a little background for people who may not know about, what the realities were of trying to make films in the UK in
the
those
truth
years?
is that really from during the 60s and pretty much from the late 60s to the early 80s in particular, the British film industry, from a creative and serious point of view, was at its lowest ebb. It survived only as an outreach of Hollywood. I mean, a lot of Hollywood pictures were shot in and around the UK, particularly using the UK studios. I mean, the only thing that kept the UK studios open, apart from some James Bond films, were Hollywood products, and even they were obviously backed from Hollywood. And it was impossible in that period to get indigenous, serious British feature films made. There were exceptions, but they were really the exceptions. But in television, and particularly BBC television, more than anywhere else, and particularly BBC, because the BBC was at that time, this is no longer the case, was an extremely liberal and creative environment where people were really allowed to explore and to do things, In that context, we were able. There was Ken Loach was the pioneer with his producer Tony Garnett, who in fact produced my first television thing. The tradition, which I know was reflected in traditions here as well, of television drama, was the television play. I'm old enough to remember when the plays on television were live. You would see them, when I was a kid, you could see a play that was performed in the studio on Sunday night and on Thursday night and on Sunday night. And the thing was to watch them to see how they differed, to see what the mistakes were, what the differences were between the two performances. It was theatre with a television camera pointed at it. It was theatrical, it was static, it was stayed. And that really continued to be, on the whole, the nature of television studio-bound drama, right through to something like about 1966, 67, when Ken Loach, with Tony Garnett, decided to challenge the status quo and to get out there with the guys that would normally shoot news with lightweight cameras. They could see what the Nouvelle Vague guys were doing. They could see that there were new, you could shoot on 16mm with lightweight cameras and shoot it in a newsreel mode. And the idea was to get out there and tell stories about, real issues in the mode of news and documentary, which, of course, is the birth of Ken Loach and his style. The most famous of those films was Cathy Come Home, about homelessness, which actually got the law changed in the UK. And this really changed the landscape and the face of things. Those things were first of all known as the Wednesday play. It was still called play. And then later, which is when I came along in the early 1970s, it was called Play for Today. But they were all films, pretty much, with rare exceptions. And there was some extraordinary work when every week you would get something or other, and they always in some way investigated something important out there in society. And there was a huge range of not only directors and writers, but actors really committed to exploring and expressing the real world and issues out there. And I was lucky enough, through Tony Garnett, Loach's producer, to come in and start doing that. And over the next 12 years or so, I did a whole range of those, I think 8 or 9 of those films.
And was it a period of frustration at all because you had made a theatrical feature that had been acclaimed?
It was a complicated thing. I mean, we all used to sit around saying, we make these films that nobody out there in the world knows we do them. They think there's no British, indigenous, serious British cinema, but here it is. It's alive and well. It's hiding in television. We don't get to film festivals. In the States, they don't know what we're doing, etc., etc. And, of course, we used to say, why can't we make these films on 35mm? Why can't they have a theatrical release and then be shown on television? And, of course, there were any number of reasons why that wasn't feasible. But on the other hand, the argument people used to argue with each other, is to say, yeah, but we make these films and they only get 2 or 3 airings, but at a stroke, you can get 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10 million viewers. And what's important and why, incidentally, this kind of thing doesn't happen on British television anymore, is that at that time there were only 3 television channels. The BBC, the non-commercial channel, BBC Two, which was a non-commercial channel, and 1 independent television commercial channel with commercials. And because there were so few channels, they were concerned with ratings, but not to the extent that it inhibited what went on. So it was very rich. And because the viewer only had 3 channels to choose from, you could get at my stage play, which we did as a television play for today, Abigail's Party, actually scored 16 million viewers. Not least because it went out on a very stormy night when storms raged throughout the British Isles. There was an ITV strike, so there was 1 channel out, and there was a very, very highbrow programme on BBC Two. So on BBC One, everybody tuned in, and the play became, and it remains extremely popular for that reason. Quite apart from his merits, of course. There was a dichotomy, we were getting our work in front of audiences, and it was part of people's lives, but at the same time we felt excluded from world cinema, which we felt very qualified to be part of. And then Channel 4 started. And the point about Channel 4 in the UK was quite simply that there would be a channel that would put money into co-productions, independent productions of all kinds of programmes, not least films. And the films, the BBC guys, people in the BBC ran Channel 4, and they'd been listening to what we'd said over the years, and indeed it became possible, films were made which were done theatrically, exported internationally, shown at festivals, had a theatrical life, and then were shown on television. And that changed the landscape again, and it was then that it became possible for many of us, and finally even me, to make feature films. Now, what had happened one of the big questions that I am inevitably asked is, if there's no script, and if you don't know what it's about, and if you won't say what it's about, and if you won't discuss casting, how is it that anybody gives you any money? And I have to say that that remains one of the great mysteries of life for me, actually, even as we speak. So the first film, Bleak Moments, we were lucky, I and my producer then were lucky, because the British actor Albert Finney, who had been in Tony Richardson's Oscar-winning film Tom Jones, adapted from Fielding's novel, Albert had opted for a percentage rather than a fee, and had made a huge amount of money out of it, and decided at the age of, I think it was about 36 at the time, to put money into some young filmmakers' films. So Stephen Frears' first film, Gumshoe, was backed by Albert, which Albert acted in, and he backed Bleak Moments. So that was very lucky. That made Bleak Moments happen. Then I started to do these films for the BBC, and there it was extraordinary, because, you know, I'd go in and they'd say, well, those are the dates. This is project number KZF 0058769B, and you know, those are the dates, and that's the budget, and go away and make a film, you know. And because that happened all those times over that dozen or so years, by the time Channel, and they were established and they were popular and people got that it was feasible in some way, that by the time the Channel 4 movies began, I'd kind of established a portfolio, and therefore it became feasible to make films for the cinema in that way.
Well, we're going to see a clip from one of these films, High Hopes.
Well, High Hopes, in fact, isn't one of the television films.
No, from when you start making films for
the second
cinemas,
feature film after the 17-year gap. Yes.
And this is another another two-hander, albeit with, I'd say, a cheerier couple. Cyril, a Marxist bike messenger, and Shirley, who's a kind of, you could also say, I think, an ancestor of Poppy in some ways.
Yes, I have to just say, I hate to disagree with you. I don't actually think he's a Marxist. I think what's important about the film is that he's by instinct a socialist, and of course what the film is about is the problem of working out how not to sit on the fence and how to put your money where your mouth is. I think it's important that he's a socialist. I don't really think he's a Marxist.
But he's kind of misread Marx in a way.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
well,
he idolizes
him. He understands Marx, but I don't
Yeah.
think he's a Marxist, really.
Without further ado.
I mean, I understand Marx, but I'm not a Marxist. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who understand Marx, by which I mean Karl Marx, not Groucho. But
People was being exploited. Industrial revolution, they was forced off the land into the factories. There weren't no working class for them. He set down a programme for change.
He's got his whole family in there with him.
Without Marx, there wouldn't have been nothing.
Oh, look, his grandson was only 4 when he died.
Well, kids died young in them days.
I know.
Wouldn't have been no unions, no welfare state, no nationalised industries.
I wish I'd bought some flowers now.
I would propose, although you may beg to differ, that this is probably the most overtly political film that you've made, although even at that point I wouldn't put it in the category of Ken Loach. The politics are still sort of under the surface of the film, and they're used in a way of bringing characters sort of into conflict with each other, like we see in that scene. It's that Cyril's, you know, clinging to his worldview, whether it's socialism or his views on family, is creating this personal tension. It's always coming back to people. So I'm wondering, maybe you can talk about, you know, how you feel politics function.
I know what you mean when you say that this is the most political film. I actually don't think it is. I think it's possible for you to say that because probably this is the film in which they most obviously, people, the most obvious and straightforward and simple way, talk about politics. But I actually don't think it is any more political in terms of what the film implicitly says and how I'm looking at the world and what I'm saying implicitly by my reflections on the world than any of the other films, including Happy-Go-Lucky, which has a great deal, I think, to say about all kinds of things, about obviously dealing with personal politics, with one of the main preoccupations throughout all of my films, not least Happy-Go-Lucky, and certainly this film, High Hopes, is the struggle that we all have between, basically the struggle between order and anarchy, between the received idea and freedom, between conservatism and liberal approaches to life. At a very obvious level, Happy-Go-Lucky is concerned with the politics of teaching and education. The dynamics of power and how people do and don't and want to and resist controlling each other. It runs throughout all the films in all kinds of ways. So I don't, the inadvertently implied notion that some of the films are in some ways perhaps not political or apolitical is simply not true. This film, High Hopes, and its two predecessors, in order, Meantime, 4 Days in July and High Hopes, are certainly the three films that in a more specific way were motivated by Thatcher. Meantime is very much a film about unemployment, and at the time when we made that film was, I think, 4 years into Thatcher's appalling regime, and it isn't funny, unfortunately. And unemployment was a serious issue, and the Thatcher government was inventing these bogus palliative schemes to be dealing with it, which is in some way parodied in what happens in the film. 4 Days in July is simply an investigation and a reflection on the situation in Northern Ireland, which I spent a year doing. And this film really was finally a reflection on whether it's possible to really act on what you believe in, or whether you just sit on the fence and talk about it, really. People have talked about Naked as being a post-Thatcher something or other. And I think that leads me to say something else about all of these films and what I try and do, and in fact what I instinctively and inevitably do, which is that, somebody who I think is in the audience, a journalist, asked me just a few hours ago about whether I in some way consciously was presenting a portrait of or showing life in Britain and England for an American audience. And that simply isn't on the agenda, and because I don't consider that what I do is, in the first place, about Britain or about England or about London or anything. Of course it is. It's the milieu, it's our world, it's where we're rooted, and that's the territory. Those are the specifics. But actually, what I'm concerned with are, without wanting to sound pompous, are universal themes. I think that the characters and the situations ultimately are not exclusively English or anything. They're universal, really. And actually, I think that even these films which we can see at a certain level in the context of Thatcher's Britain are not fundamentally about that. They're about the way we live, irrespective. And so the idea that Naked was a post-Thatcher film errs on the ridiculous, because, you know, it's got nothing to do with that at all. It's to do with, you know, a much broader preoccupation with fundamental aspects of being, really. And I think that really would apply right across the board. I think the film that most interestingly, I would have thought, raises questions, and I actually already dealt with this, I've just realised in something I said earlier, in the context of the discussion about the politics of these films, is Topsy Turvy, which I think is very much a political film, and it is about power, it is about industry, it is about working relationships, it is about the tension between the received ideas of what you should be and what you feel you are naturally compelled to do. It is about responsibility for other people, and it is about, as always, about sexual politics. And, as always, and we've just seen an example of it in this clip, and it applies all the way down the line, including Topsy Turvy. I mean, it addresses my endless ongoing preoccupation with not only living and dying, but having children, not having children, being a parent, having parents, having babies, being pregnant, unwanted pregnancies, etc. The whole gamut of things, you know, adoption, all of those things are inevitably come back, and actually find myself, I look around and think, oh, I'm doing that again. We're back there again, you know, because it's an inevitable thing that one is endlessly preoccupied with, you know, in life.
Well, something else that seems to be a running concern, but I think you feel it particularly strongly in this film and in Secrets and Lies.
This film,
High Hopes, and in Secrets and Lies, is the gap between how people are and how they want to be perceived by others. In this movie, in High Hopes, Cyril has this rather grotesque sister who sort of wants to be seen as a bourgeois society lady. In Secrets and Lies, all of the secrets that people are holding on to are really because it affects how they wish to be perceived by.
I think masks is a subject, is a way of, you know. I think it is the tension between how. I mean, you know, we've talked about how Sylvia is an ancestor of Poppy. I mean, the whole thing about Poppy and all that, a whole run of characters are. Those are the characters that embody freedom and being truthful and being who you are. And, you know, if you like, to crystallise what we're talking about, the classic Mike Leigh thing in Happy Go Lucky is, you know, she goes to see her pregnant sister, who is in fact, a descendant of various characters, including the one you just referred to in High Hopes, is, just totally preoccupied with the done thing and how she thinks we ought to live and what, and all of those things. And that tension is fundamental to all of us and is indeed what endlessly is under investigation, certainly.
Well, we've talked quite a bit indirectly about Naked, so it's probably time that we looked at a clip from that. And this is from quite late in the film, after Johnny, who's this sort of poet laureate of the back alley, has been out on a pretty long night that has included being beaten up by a pack of thugs, and he's come back to the flat of his sort of girlfriend Louise and her flatmate Sophie, with whom he's also had sexual relations by this point in the film, and that's what we're going to see.
So why did you come to London?
I come to run in the marathon.
Will you give me a straight answer, please?
Well, I had to get out of Manchester because I was going to get a beating, and I come down here and get a beating.
I picked that scene because, this film, I think, probably fair to say at the time, maybe the most acclaimed and widely seen film you had made up to that point, but it was also attacked in some circles. It was called misogynist. The sexual violence of the film was written about in a negative way. by some critics, and yet this is a very tender moment, which in some ways I think is the heart of the film. This is really the core of the relationship between these three characters. So in a way, I guess it's another kind of question about perception and reality. Is we were talking before, some critics writing about Happy-Go-Lucky managed to not mention the visual aspect of the film at all. Is this, what is your feeling about the way your films are received versus the way you may have intended them to be received, or what you may think they're actually about versus what people write about?
Well, I think, you see, sometimes I reflect on this and I realise that actually you can't have it both ways, really. By which I mean that plainly what I don't do, which many a movie healthily does do, is to create a linear narrative, which is where everything that happens serves a specific narrow band of action and a particular set of clear objectives, and that nothing happens outside of the causal requirements of the narrative action. But I don't do that, as we very well know. I mean, I create a world which, sure, there's a story, and sure, there are main things that go on, but, all kinds of things are happening because of the kind of films that I make, because it's kind of this whole thing of, people like real people, and therefore everything that happens is resonant with layers and contradictions in some way. That, I very definitely make films where I finally am saying to you, the audience, walk away from the film. I haven't resolved. It's not resolved. I'm not telling you the one thing to think. You cannot walk away. I defy anyone to walk away from any film of mine with a very clear instruction from me as to what I'm telling you my message is, because it's much more complex than that. You have things to walk away with, to reflect upon, to share, to argue about, to ponder about, to decide in terms of what happened or what should happen or what will happen afterwards or whatever it is. And that is the nature of the films. And therefore, they are actually open to massive interpretation. And since they are about us, and people do and must and can only react to them subjectively in some way, inevitably, people have all kinds of reactions, not all of which are above being self-deceptive or disingenuous, or just simply complicated, and somehow people don't always necessarily confront what they should because it gets them in some way. And all kinds of things go on. And so that for every film I make, there's always an extreme spectrum of reactions. I mean, Happy-Go-Lucky, there are people who, the majority of people, share my feeling about it, which is that the central character, Poppy, is somebody who, though you could be forgiven at the beginning, possibly, of thinking, am I going to be able to spend 2 hours with this person? By the end, you can only fall in love with her because she's such a positive and compelling and warm and giving person. But there are people, including some critics in various places, who said, by the end, I wanted to throttle her. I wanted to kill her. She was such an irritating woman. And I don't get that, really, but I understand that it's open to, Now, when this film came out, Naked, it was accused, as you say, of being a misogynist film. Ridiculous, because, in fact, if anything, it's an attack on unacceptable male behaviour. And indeed, one of the things that was said about the film, and you just see in this moment, just now, it was said quite widely that this is a film in which all the women are doormats and all the women are abused. And it simply isn't true, basically. And in fact, although I wouldn't want the following statement to be confused with that preposterous suggestion that people who are raped ask for it, which is obviously not a notion that I would endorse. Nevertheless, in fact, the only actual female characters in the film who are in any way abused do put themselves in a position where they don't actively resist it or discourage it. But that's in the nature of that particular investigation. But, I mean, you know, it's like people saying that Happy Go Lucky is very different from all the other films because it's the first happy film. Well, it isn't, and it isn't just a happy film. It's much more complex than that. So these things are open to... But as I say, actually, I can't have it both ways. You know, if there's no way I can legitimately expect everybody to react to it in the same way because that's not how these films work, obviously.
Well, some people have also said that Poppy is in some way related to Johnny in this film, that they're two sides of a coin, or that where he sees apocalypse around every corner, she sees the glasses always being half full. Do you see this kind of dialogue between
I do. I mean, I have to say, just for the record, that it never occurred to me to compare the films at all until I'd finished Happy Go Lucky and started to share it with people and think about it and stuff. But apart from the sort of technical fact that these are the two films, far more than any other I've made, which focus more exclusively on a single central protagonist. I think the interesting comparison is between Poppy and Johnny, as you say. I mean, what they have in common is, without question, they are both idealists. They were both eschew the same materialism. They would both believe in the same causes. The difference is, as you say, I mean, Johnny is an embittered, frustrated, disappointed idealist who's turned it on himself, and Poppy is the opposite, obviously.
Well, we're running a little long, and I want to turn it over to the audience. So I'm just going to show one more clip, which is from Secrets and Lies. It's also from quite late in the film, and I wanted to show this scene because there's a very famous long scene in this movie where Cynthia, played by Brenda Blethyn, is meeting her adopted daughter Hortense in a cafe near the Holborn tube station for the first time. It goes on for something like 8 or 9 minutes, and it's quite remarkable. But this is another not quite as long scene, but which I think is in some ways equally remarkable, or maybe even more so, because of the sheer amount of activity that is going on, and it also from one single fixed camera perspective with no editing.
Do you live in a flat then, Hortense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's her own. She's got a mortgage and everything.
Whereabouts are you?
Kilburn.
It's a bit of a schlep, isn't it? The old Kent Road and back every day.
Just she drives.
No doubt it has the effect of being like life, improvised, but then I think all this stuff should have that effect because life is improvised, you know. But of course that was very precisely worked out. It took a very long time to do so. The reason why I held it in one static shot is because we're about to go indoors when it rains, and we're about to get into the whole thing of the truth coming out, and there's going to be a lot of, you know, intercutting and shots and moving around and, you know, tension. And that tension is building up in what we've just watched. And I felt that if I held it in a single static shot like that and allowed all the action to go on, because what's actually going on, I mean, apart from all the stuff to do with the steaks and the mustard and the drinks and the sausages and all the rest of that, which is, by the way, much harder to work with than actors, because the actors can decide what they're going to do and what they're going to say and the order in which they're going to say it and the rhythm of it. But the sausages and the steaks have got their own will, and they'll jump around and do all kinds of things. However, the reason why I wanted it to be like is because what's actually going on is we know that Hortense is Cynthia's daughter, and they don't know that, and we wonder, and all that's they're busking it and telling these terrible lies about working together and things. And we know, I mean, you, the audience, are sitting there waiting for the shit to hit the fan, and you know it's building up. And I thought if I leave it in a static shot, apart from the fact that in terms of the aesthetics of film narrative, if that's a static shot there, it's going to go into something that's got that kind of rhythm with lots of shots in the next bit. But also, you can just do your work of looking at everything that's happening and seeing this whole complex thing unfolding, and rather than me leading you to it. So that seemed to make sense, and that's why we went to the lengths of deconstructing and reconstructing and finally constructing this very elaborate piece of action.
Well, 2 points that I would just bring up is that, one, I think you can look at that scene out of context, and what's remarkable about it is you understand the dynamics between all of the characters. Even if you've never seen the movie, you have a real sense of what the different tensions are in that scene. The other thing is, you had said earlier that sometimes when you're on the location, you first really start to see the film visually. And one of the things in this film is that there are all of these scenes in Morris's portrait studio where he's taking these sort of very kind of run-of-the-mill portrait photos that people go in and have taken. But there are a lot of scenes like this one outside of the portrait studio that have the look of family photographs. And I'm wondering if that's something you had in mind from the beginning, or it was once you got on the location and were working.
Yes, and incidentally, apart from anything else, that all resonated with my grandfather's line of trade, which I've already talked about. Just about the first thing you just said, I think it's interesting that the thing about you get the dynamics and the relationships even if you don't know the context of the film. I was at a session with an audience last night in Boston, and somebody said that what they liked about my films is that I don't explain everything, and I don't everything is not dotted, all this. I's aren't dotted, the T's crossed in terms of explanation of who's who and what's what. And I was saying that, and I think this is important as well, and this goes right back to something I was saying right at the beginning of this conversation, that life is inherently interesting, and in fact, you can get into a bus or go into a shopping mall or whatever, and just come in on the middle of a conversation between two people or some people, a group of people about whom you know nothing, and you immediately can start to know a great deal about who they are and what's what and what's going on and all kinds of stuff, just because it's there, it comes ready explicit in a way. So that is a principle that of course, I do a great deal of work in the dramatic construction of things to make sure that we do reveal information so that you can orientate. But it is the case that real life does give us all kinds of information packed right through the sausage, wherever you slice it.
I think on that note, not to flatter myself by any means, but Mike Leigh,